a former Austrian Foreign Minister, author and academic. The one-time independent politician, Dr. Karin Kneissl, has never shied away from controversy. She infamously danced with the Russian President Vladimir Putin at her wedding and is often outspoken in her criticism of European diplomacy. I'm Melinda Nusofora, and I sat down here in Istanbul with Dr. Kneissl for this edition of One-on-One. Dr. Kneissl, thank you so much for your time here on TRT World. You're in Istanbul speaking on a panel entitled Türkiye, the Energy Hub of the Future. Why is that an apt title, and what role do you see Türkiye playing as energy security becomes all the more important in the years and months ahead?
Well, you see, there are two things in life you can never change. One is geography and the other is demography. You can change a political system, an economic system within an afternoon. We have seen that over history many times. But geography makes Türkiye, gives it a place in this whole energy debate, and not for the first time. When we remember the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline that was built by BP about 20 years ago, it was all about Türkiye as the important transit corridor to bring Caspian oil into the Mediterranean and from there then to European markets. So that was the big BP thing, which also went along with certain geopolitical agenda in the Caucasus that we had then. We saw for years the so-called Nabucco project. Nabucco was under the lead management of the Austrian OMV. It was coined in December 2002 and it was cancelled in May 2013. I followed that project very closely, and during those years Türkiye gained a tremendous importance also for the European Commission. Everybody was eager to also accompany talks, negotiations, which started again in 2004, not for the first time, about Türkiye joining the European Union. And Nabucco played a very important role because Nabucco was also a symbol for this important role of the geography, once again, of this country as an interface, as a kind of, well, this plaque tournante, as you would say in French, the English term I'm now not having in the back of my mind, but where, because of geography, it plays its role. We know the notions of geostrategy, geoeconomics, geo whatever. It always breaks down to geography. And the Bosporus, once again, is now, I would say, even the gate to the world. Not only from a Russian perspective, not only for Ukrainian sunflower oil or Russian grain or vessels carrying oil and gas. You can see it, it's physically there, that the traffic has increased.
You've been a very outspoken critic of the current sanctions imposed on Russia, particularly by European countries and in particular the energy sector. When we look at price caps on Russian oil, is that going to have any impact in steering Russia back to the table of diplomacy? Do you see price caps as having any place in the world energy markets?
No, I think that I'm a strong believer in market forces of supply and demand. And the moment buyers come to the market and say, we put on a price, it doesn't work. We have seen it with sellers doing that, and it didn't work also too well. Now, when the buyers want to put a price, it's a total blurring of market forces. And we can already see that ever since the oil price cap and the gas price cap were enshrined in December and then February this year for the gas, it didn't really materialize the goals that were initially envisaged.
Would you say then that the sanctions as a whole have been a failure so far?
You see, sanctions are, even in private life, you don't have to go to the big topic of international relations. It's about you sanction somebody because you want to coerce this other into a change of behavior. Now, has Russia changed its behavior? No, it hasn't. So has Russia failed? Is it these sanctions from hell, as they were coined, did they achieve it? No. Also, when we look at the trust that is gone in terms of what happens to financial transactions, central bank money, I think a lot of actors on the globe, while watching the sanction regime against Russia, were also thinking, well, it could also happen to us. So this also interplays with, I would say, a loss of trust in certain institutions. And this is the main loss, because trust you cannot buy, trust you have to earn. We have seen it also with another topic that is Credit Suisse, Swiss marketplace, Swiss financial place, and I'm pretty sure that there will be also other topics hooked to that because funds are simply withdrawn.
As well as being an energy expert and an energy analyst, you're an author, a former politician. You wrote a book on diplomacy. Yep. Do you think the current situation in Russia and Ukraine could have and should have been avoided through diplomacy? Yep. What went wrong?
The diplomacy, under inverted comma, that took place in January, February 2022 was not true diplomacy. I mean, some of us remember only the large table and 30-minute talks. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian Foreign Minister, when he met his then counterpart Liz Truss, said in the press conference, Ms. Truss is speaking in tweets, which sums it up that there was no real conducting of something like what you would call listening to the other, understanding the motivation. In the case of the Russian side, it was all about a security architecture needed for Central Eastern Europe. And it was not just about the territorial dispute, about claims. It was all about security in the largest sense.
So who dropped the ball then? Which country, which group could have or should have done more to avoid the situation the world finds itself in now?
Well, we had three countries actually very much involved in the so-called Minsk agreement that was brokered in summer 2014. And we were repeating, we as the European Union, we were repeating our commitment to the Minsk agreement, but if I may recall the statement by former Chancellor Angela Merkel, she said very bluntly, Minsk was all about gaining time for Ukraine. And in some instances in blockade in international relations, of course you need a management of a situation to gain time, but this gaining time should never be just in favor of one conflict party and to the detriment of the other party to the conflict. So Minsk was a tremendous deception, I would say, in terms of negotiating a settlement. So it was strongly discussed in Russia in December last year when that statement was made by Angela Merkel. It was not at all discussed in the Western media. So I think what went wrong in terms of diplomacy, diplomacy, if you want to bring it to a mathematic formula, it's remain on speaking terms in all circumstances. And these speaking terms we have not seen. You know, it was a lot of verbal attacks, let's say. Russia has to be defeated on the military field. Josep Borrell saying last year this war will not be won, it will have to be decided on the battlefield. So instead of talks, we saw tanks, and this is still the situation.
Do you think we can flip that? Is there any possibility, to your mind, of diplomacy bringing an end to this, or is it too far gone?
Trust is gone, and you can never start any talks. First you need trust, you need an agenda, and you need some sort of symmetry between partners. When China came up with its 12 points, it was rebuffed by Washington and Brussels. Inter alia, there was the argument, well, it's just points, it's not a peace plan. Yes, it cannot be a peace plan because the parties to the conflict have to negotiate. But you cannot go into a talk without having some sort of agenda setting. These are the topics we are ready to talk about. Territorial sovereignty, on the one hand, which is of course of utmost interest for Ukraine, lifting of sanctions, which is of interest for the Russians. So there is a give and take. There will always be some sort of compromise, but the way, it's not only the fact, but I would say in particular the way the Chinese initiative was rebuffed in a very impolite way, rough, rude way. This shows us that for the time being, I would say there's very little interest from Brussels, from Washington to really go for it, because Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, showed interest in this Chinese initiative.
You mentioned China, so I will ask you as we begin to wrap up our conversation, do you believe that Russia and China really do have joint goals, joint strategies, and that they have a mutual understanding of where they want to work towards together? Or have they been forced together by a mutual resentment for, say, the United States and the West?
Well, if we go back 20 years ago, Iraq war started just about 20 years ago. Turkey was also in a difficult position then. People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation started to coordinate their voting pattern in the Security Council, and it was just in the United Nations Security Council, which is important but not that important when we compare it to what is happening right now, namely a very, very strong alignment in international relations. And that's the way it was already coined in their papers in February last year when President Putin came to Beijing. So it already was a start, but I think that they were not really forced. What I admire about this very strong cooperation, they don't call it an alliance, they don't call it a partnership, it's just some sort of cooperation, is that...
A special friendship.
Yeah. I would say it's interesting because to my knowledge and experience, it's always very difficult to have good relations with your immediate neighbor. Usually you have better relations with the neighbor of your neighbor. And this long terrestrial border, this long history of also war and peace on both sides, for the last 20 years there has been this rapprochement on so many levels. So I don't think that they were forced by the United States. They did it out of their own interests, and both have interests, and it's a give and take.
Dr. Kneissl, thank you so much for your time here on TRT World. We appreciate your insight.
You're most welcome. Thank you for the invitation.